Welcome back, Professor Reilly. Well, based on what you're saying, based on what I'm reading, based on the data, really, police brutality is not the issue that is holding back people in these various communities. What is holding back people in these various communities, and why is the narrative so heavily focused on police brutality?
Well, I think that's a very complex question that gets into a lot of things, like the difference between historic and contemporary racism. So, first of all, one thing that I would say is that minority communities in the United States have gone through and come through a lot. The black community endured slavery, at least in the South, endured Jim Crow, the crack era, so on down the line. And you've actually seen some pretty steady closures of gaps between blacks and whites. Just looking at this casually, doing some research the other day, I mean, the black SAT rose from about 1800, as I recall, the 1970s, to 950, looking at College Board data just a couple of years ago. So the black story in America is not a story of tragedy. But when you look at things that are genuinely problematic at a large scale in the black community, I think you're seeing legacies of racism in the past, i.e. you're looking at poverty, housing, so on down the line. And even more to the point, to me, you're seeing legacies of the 1960s welfare state. Fatherlessness, for example, is the biggest problem. I'm not just going to blame black people here. The biggest problem among all groups in America. The great economist Walter Williams in 1938 looked at rates of fatherlessness for whites. As I recall, that was under 4%. For African Americans, it was 11%. Those same rates today are 35.4% for Caucasians, including Caucasian Hispanics, over 50%, close to 60% for Hispanics and Native Americans, 72% for African Americans. And obviously, the presence of a father, and particularly a young man's life, is one of the biggest predictors of how well he's going to do in high school, how likely he is to go to jail, things like suicide. That's especially true, by the way, for lower income Caucasian Americans. So I think there are very broad systemic problems in the black community and in many American communities. I would say the collapse of the family and the things associated with this, small business community, social sector, probably the biggest one. Why is it so tempting to blame the ghosts of the past? I think to some extent, two reasons. One, we're used to doing so. And two, there is broad social approval. So, I mean, celebrities, LeBron James, for example, know that if they say the cause of every one of these problems, such as fatherlessness or the test score gap, is racism, one, that is going to be greeted very approvingly by a network of natural allies throughout society. And two, it will sound like something that most people are used to hearing. But dealing with the actual problems in African American communities and other communities is going to take more than the eradication of racism. And it's worth noting, by the way, that the large majority of people, black and white, are not racist in any conventional sense today. We might look at the results on some complex implicit bias test and be a little worried for a bit. But if you look at actual classic questions, would you vote for a qualified member of the other race for president if they ran with your political party? The figure for that's 92% for African Americans and for whites. Well over 80% of people support interracial dating, marriage, love. So I don't think we can simply look at an issue like violence in cities and say, well, that's due to racism. One thing you have to point out is that many of the large cities in the United States of America have been controlled by Democratic, often minority-led administrations for decades. So if there is a problem with the schools in Detroit or with gun violence in the streets, you can't necessarily just say, well, that's the white man.
Mm-hmm. And also, on this interracial issue you raise, I looked at statistics based on a few years back, and it indicated that new marriages, 17% or almost 1 in 5, are interracial. Now, how can you have systemic racism? One out of every 5 marriages is interracial, and the other statistics you provide. Say, I could be wrong about this, and I'd like to pose this to you for the next segment. This notion of systemic racism means everything and means nothing. It's an excuse for not addressing the real issues that exist in these communities and other communities. You pointed out one-party rule, one-party ideology, one-party economic ideology. So there's a battle. There are obstacles to things like school choice that exist in other parts of the country. but not in the inner cities. You have the Democrat Party that has opposed this. As I said earlier in the show, Barack Obama led the battle against school choice in many of these communities. And so if you're going to have truly revolutionary and radical ideas, you have to have competition politically, competition in the schools, and opportunities. I'd like your thought on that when we return. We'll be right back.